The day Edith Rhodes rode into Caldwell, Kansas with nothing but a carpetbag, a loaded derringer, and a heart full of grief was the same day Roy Fairchild decided he was done with love forever, and neither of them had any idea that fate had something entirely different in mind. The year was 1879, and Caldwell sat perched at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man leaning too far over a cliff, half wild and half desperate to be something more. The cattle drives had made it rich and dangerous in equal measure. Saloons outnumbered churches 4-1, and the smell of horse sweat, trail dust, and wood smoke hung in the summer air like something permanent. It was not the kind of town a woman alone should ride into without knowing exactly what she was doing. Edith Rhodes, for the most part, knew exactly what she was doing. She was 26 years old, recently widowed, and freshly swindled out of the small farm her husband Thomas had left her outside of Wichita. The lawyers had been creative with their paperwork, her brother-in-law had been creative with his lies, and Edith had been left with the clothes on her back, a handful of coins, and a quiet fury that burned clean and steady like a lantern in a windstorm. She had taken the last of her money, bought passage on a rattling stage south along the trail, and arrived in Caldwell with a plan that was held together mostly by stubbornness. She needed work, she needed a roof, and she needed to rebuild from nothing, which she had done before and could do again. The stage depot dropped her in front of the Drover's Rest Hotel, a 2-story clapboard building with a crooked sign and a porch full of cowboys who had just finished a season's drive north from Texas. They looked at her with the blunt curiosity of men who spent more time with cattle than with women, and Edith looked back at them with the calm steadiness of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by stares. She adjusted her dark traveling coat, picked up her carpetbag, and walked straight through the front door. The hotel's proprietor was a wide, square-faced woman named Mrs. Alma Gentry, who had the disposition of someone who had seen everything and was impressed by very little. She looked Edith up and down from behind the front desk with the practiced eye of a woman who could size up a person's situation in about 4 seconds flat. "Traveling alone?" Mrs. Gentry asked. "Yes, ma'am," Edith said. "Husband, deceased." Mrs. Gentry was quiet for a moment. "You looking for work or just a room? Both, if there's any to be had." Something shifted in the older woman's expression, not quite softness but recognition. "I need a girl who can keep books and manage the supply orders. The last one ran off with a cowboy from San Antonio. Pay is fair, room included. You have any experience?" "I kept the books for my husband's farm for 6 years," Edith said. "I can also cook and I'm a decent shot with a pistol, though I don't imagine that last skill comes up much in the hotel trade." Mrs. Gentry looked at her for one more long moment and then nodded. "Rooms at the top of the stairs. You start tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. That was how Edith Rhodes came to Caldwell, clean and simple, like most of the best decisions in life. She did not expect to meet anyone. She was not looking for anyone. The wound that Thomas's death had left, followed so quickly by the betrayal of his family, had made her draw herself inward like a flower closing against cold weather. She was civil to everyone she encountered in her new work. She was efficient, honest, and good at her job, but she kept her walls up and her heart safely behind them, and she thought that was the right and sensible thing to do. She had not counted on Roy Fairchild. Roy had come up to Caldwell with a trail crew from the Rocking H Ranch in southern Texas, driving close to 2,000 longhorns up the Kishom Trail for a Kansas City buyer. He was 30 years old, lean and sun-browned, with dark hair that was always slightly too long and gray eyes that had a way of going very still when he was thinking hard about something. He had been working cattle drives since he was 16, first as a wrangler, then as a drover, and for the past 2 years as trail boss for the Rocking H. He was good at the job. He was good at most practical things, because practical things made sense to him in a way that people sometimes did not. He had been engaged once, 3 years ago, to a woman named Clara in San Antonio. Clara had waded through one drive and then decided that wading through a second was more than she was willing to do. She had married a banker, and Roy had come back from the trail to an empty house and a polite letter. He had been quiet about it the way he was quiet about most things, but something in him had settled into a kind of resolved solitude after that. He was not bitter, exactly. He just did not see the point in wanting something that the nature of his life made impossible to keep. He arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday in late July, when the heat was fierce enough to make the horizon shimmer, and the cattle were too tired to do much more than stand in their pens and breathe. He settled his crew at the White Horse Saloon, checked on the sale negotiations his trail boss responsibilities required, and then did what he always did in a new town. He walked until he had mapped it in his mind. He was crossing the main street, stepping around a puddle of mud left from a water trough that had overflowed, when the door of the drover's rest swung open and Edith Rhodes walked out with a ledger book under one arm and a look of focused determination on her face that made him stop mid-step. She was not the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in the conventional sense that men talked about in bunkhouses. But there was something about the way she carried herself, straight and unhurried, that caught his attention like a hand on his sleeve. She was dark-haired, with a few strands loosening from her pins in the July heat, and her eyes, when they flicked briefly to him as she passed, were a shade of brown so deep they were almost black. She walked past him without a word, completely unself-conscious, clearly in the middle of something that had nothing to do with him. He stood there for a moment longer than was necessary, and then shook his head slightly and kept walking. He told himself he had imagined the moment. He told himself it was just the heat. He did not entirely convince himself. The cattle sale took 3 days to negotiate, which was longer than Roy had hoped and shorter than the buyer had wanted. During those 3 days, Roy found himself eating supper at the Drover's Rest Hotel twice, because the food was better than at the saloon and the noise level was lower, which was the only reason he gave himself. The hotel had a small dining room off the lobby with 4 tables covered in checked cloth and a kitchen that produced surprisingly good biscuits and beef stew. On the first evening, he saw Edith only briefly. She was moving between the kitchen and the front desk, carrying a stack of supply receipts, and she did not look up. On the second evening, she was sitting at the corner table with the hotel's ledger open in front of her, working by lamplight with a pen and a look of quiet concentration, while the dining room hummed around her. Roy sat at the table nearest the window, ordered his supper, and tried not to look in her direction. He succeeded for about 10 minutes. It was the way she frowned at the numbers that got him. Not a frustrated frown, but a thinking frown, a small, precise gathering of her brows that suggested she was following the logic of something to its end. He had always admired people who could think clearly. It was a quality he valued more than most. Mrs. Gentry appeared from the kitchen, leaned over Edith's shoulder, pointed at something in the ledger, and said something in a low voice. Edith shook her head, pointed at a different line, and Mrs. Gentry's expression shifted from skepticism to reluctant agreement. Edith had clearly caught an error and was patiently explaining it without making the older woman feel foolish. Roy watched this exchange and felt something shift quietly in his chest, which he immediately tried to ignore. He paid his bill and left without speaking to her. On the third evening, which was also the evening the cattle sale was finalized, Roy came to the hotel dining room later than usual. Most of the other diners had gone. The room was quiet, lit by 2 oil lamps on the wall and the orange remains of sunset through the single west-facing window. Roy sat down, and a moment later Edith came from the kitchen doorway with a notepad, because the usual serving girl had already gone home. "Good evening," she said, her voice businesslike and pleasant. "Tonight we have beef stew and corn bread, or there's cold chicken left from supper service." "Stew is fine," Roy said. Then, because he could not help it, he added, "I noticed you correcting the ledger entries last night." She looked at him steadily. "You noticed that?" "I was sitting close enough," he said. "You caught a transposition error in the column totals." Something in her expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but interest. You read ledgers? She asked. I manage the accounts for a trail crew, he said. Payroll, supply costs, sale tracking, it's part of the job. She studied him with those dark eyes for a moment. Most cowboys I've met consider numbers to be someone else's concern. Most cowboys I've met are right about that, he said, but someone has to do it. There was a brief pause, and then something very small and controlled happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. I'll get your stew, she said, and went back to the kitchen. She brought his supper out and did not linger, but when she set the bowl down she said, without looking at him, the error was actually a reversed entry on the supply credit column. It would have cost Mrs. Gentry $11 at the end of the month. $11 is real money, Roy said. Yes, she said. It is. And then she was gone, back to her desk and her work, and Roy sat with his stew and the particular feeling of a man who has been standing outside a closed door and has just heard someone turn the latch from the inside. He stayed in Caldwell 3 more days after the sale was completed. He told himself it was because he needed to wait for his crew to finish resting and resupplying before the ride back to Texas. That was true. It was also true that he found reasons to walk past the Drover's Rest Hotel with a frequency that a reasonable man might have questioned. On the 4th day, he walked in through the front door in the late morning and asked Mrs. Gentry if he could speak to her bookkeeper about the hotel's supply ordering system, because he was considering how the Rocking H Ranch might improve their own supply chain. It was a thin excuse, and Mrs. Gentry's expression said she knew it was a thin excuse, but she was a practical woman who understood that useful conversations happened for all kinds of reasons, and she sent him to find Edith in the back storage room. Edith was counting sacks of flour when he appeared in the doorway. She looked at him with an expression that was amused and a little wary in equal parts. Mrs. Gentry sent me, he said. I want to ask you about supply ordering. Supply ordering, she repeated, as though testing the weight of the phrase. Yes, ma'am. She set down her pencil and gave him a long, direct look. Mr. Fairchild, he said. Roy Fairchild. I'm trail boss for the Rocking H out of Laredo. Mr. Fairchild, she said. Are you actually interested in supply ordering, or is this the best reason you could think of to come talk to me? Roy felt the back of his neck get warm, which had not happened to him in a long time. He held her gaze. Honestly, he said, it started as a reason, but I am genuinely curious about how you manage the vendor accounts. You keep everything in the single ledger. She looked at him for one more moment, and then she moved to a shelf on the wall and pulled down a second, smaller book. I keep the vendor ledger separate from the house accounts, she said. It's easier to catch discrepancies. And that was how the conversation began. In a flower-smelling storage room in the back of a hotel in Caldwell, Kansas, with 2 people who were both too careful to admit they were interested in anything other than bookkeeping. They talked for 40 minutes about accounting systems, and it was one of the most engaging 40 minutes Roy could remember. Edith had a mind that was organized and precise and also unexpectedly flexible, and she had opinions about things and was not timid about expressing them, though she expressed them in a measured and deliberate way that made them hard to argue with. She also had a way of occasionally going very quiet for a moment when she was thinking, and in those moments Roy had to work not to stare at her. Before he left, he said, "Would you be willing to have supper with me this evening? I'd like to continue the conversation." She looked at him steadily. "About supply ordering, among other things," he said. There was a pause that lasted long enough that he thought she was going to say no. Then she said, 6 o'clock. The dining room here is fine. He nodded. 6 o'clock. He left before she could change her mind, walking back out into the July heat with a feeling in his chest that he recognized, distantly, and that surprised him more than he wanted to admit. Edith stood in the storage room for a moment after he had gone and looked at the middle distance. She had not had supper with a man since Thomas died. She had not wanted to. She had told herself firmly and sensibly that this was simply 2 professionals discussing something of mutual interest, and that there was nothing remarkable about it, and that Roy Fairchild's gray eyes were not something she needed to think about. She went back to counting flour sacks. Supper at 6 o'clock was neither strictly professional nor entirely personal. It existed in the interesting space between the two. They sat at the corner table in the dining room, the same table where Edith had been working with the ledger on the second evening, and they ate and talked, and the conversation wandered from accounting to cattle trails to Kansas weather to books. Edith had brought a worn copy of Jane Eyre with her in her carpetbag, which she mentioned in passing, and Roy said he had read it, which surprised her visibly and delighted him in a way he kept carefully off his face. "You read Jane Eyre," she said. "There's a lot of time on a cattle drive," he said. "Especially on night watch. If you have a book, the hours go faster." "What did you think of Rochester?" she asked. "I thought he was an interesting study in what happens when a man lets pride substitute for honesty," Roy said without hesitation. He had the capacity to be better than he was, but he kept choosing the comfortable dishonesty over the difficult truth. Edith looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. Then she said quietly, "That is a very perceptive reading. You disagree?" He said, "No," she said. "I agree completely. I'm just not used to a man who thinks about it that way." There was a silence after that, a comfortable one, the kind that happens when two people have found a register they can talk in that fits them both. Outside, the main street of Caldwell was loud with the end-of-day sounds of the cattle trade town, horses and voices, and the distant piano from the White Horse Saloon. Inside the dining room it was quiet and warm, and the lamplight was soft. Roy told her about the Kishom Trail, about what a drive actually looked like from the inside, the months of slow progress up through Indian Territory and into Kansas, the river crossings and the lightning storms, and the particular loneliness of having 3 months' worth of open sky between you and anything that could be called civilization. He talked about it without romance, which made it more interesting, not less. He described it the way someone describes a thing they have spent a long time with and understand honestly, including its difficulties. Edith listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. When he finished, she said, "Do you like it, the driving?" He thought about this for a moment. "I like knowing what to do," he said. "On the trail, most problems have solutions if you think clearly and act quickly. It's the kind of work where good judgment makes a real difference. That matters to me." "It sounds lonely, though," she said. "It is," he said, "but I think I got used to it." She looked at her coffee cup. "I know something about getting used to loneliness," she said quietly, and did not elaborate. He did not push. He recognized the quality of that silence. He had his own version of it. At the end of the evening, he walked her to the bottom of the hotel stairs and said, "Thank you for the company, Miss Rhodes." "Mrs. Rhodes," she corrected gently, "though I'm a widow." "Mrs. Rhodes," he said, "I'm sorry for your loss." She looked at him, and something behind her eyes moved in a way that was different from what he had seen earlier in the evening, less guarded. "Thank you," she said. Then, after a brief pause, "Good night, Mr. Fairchild." "Good night," he said. He walked out into the night and stood on the hotel porch for a moment, listening to the sounds of Caldwell, and felt the specific quality of a feeling he had spent 3 years trying to convince himself he did not need. He rode out of Caldwell 2 days later with his crew, south toward Texas. He had reasons to go back. He had responsibilities at the Rocking H Ranch, and a contract for another drive the following spring. He had a life that made no natural room for a woman in a Kansas hotel. He rode south. He was quiet about it, in the way he was quiet about most things. The trail back to Texas was long and ordinary and gave Roy a great deal of time to think, which was not entirely useful. He thought about the cattle business and the route logistics and the Rocking H's plans for the next year. He thought about his crew, good men, most of them, and about the business of managing a working ranch. He thought, more than he intended to, about a woman in a flower-smelling storage room who kept 2 separate ledger books and had strong opinions about Rochester. He had not asked for her permission to write. He had not said anything that could be construed as a promise. He was not the kind of man who made promises he was uncertain he could keep. But when he arrived back at the Rocking H in late August, he did something he had not planned and could not entirely explain. He sat down at the table in the bunkhouse office, pulled out a sheet of paper, and wrote a letter to Edith Rhodes at the Drover's Rest Hotel, Caldwell, Kansas. He kept it simple and honest. He said he had enjoyed their conversation and thought often of it on the ride south. He said he was not certain what he was proposing by writing, only that it seemed wrong not to. He asked if she would be willing to correspond. He signed it Roy Fairchild and sent it before he could reconsider. He did not expect a quick answer. Mail between Kansas and South Texas moved slowly and unpredictably. He put it out of his mind, or tried to, and went back to the daily work of the ranch. In Caldwell, Edith received his letter on a cool morning in mid-September, when the first hints of autumn were beginning to thin the Kansas heat. She read it twice standing at the front desk of the hotel, and then a third time sitting in her room upstairs. She held it in her hands for a while after. She had thought about Roy Fairchild more than she had wanted to after he rode out. She had thought about the gray eyes and the careful way he spoke, and the way he had said Rochester chose comfortable dishonesty over difficult truth, which was a thing that landed differently when you had recently lived through being lied to by people who should have told you the truth. She had thought about the shape of the conversation they'd had over supper, which had felt more real to her than most conversations she'd had in years. She also thought about the practical realities. She was a widow trying to rebuild her life. He was a man whose work took him months at a time across hundreds of miles of open country. She had made one life centered on a man's plans before, and when that man was gone, the plans had turned to nothing. She did not want to make the same mistake. She put the letter in the drawer of her nightstand and did not answer it for 11 days. On the 12th day, she took it out, read it once more, took out her own writing paper and wrote back. She told him she appreciated his honesty about his uncertainty because she was uncertain too. She said she had also thought about their conversations. She said she was willing to correspond, but that she wanted to be clear from the beginning that she was not a woman who would wait indefinitely for something that might never arrive, having learned the hard way that a life must be built on solid ground and not on hope alone. She signed it Edith Rhodes, and she added at the bottom that she had reread Jane Eyre recently and now thought Rochester's fundamental problem was that he had never learned to believe he deserved something honest. She posted it that afternoon and felt both lighter and more afraid than she had in months. The letters that followed over the next months were some of the most real and surprising conversations either of them had ever had. There was something about the distance and the formality of the letter format that somehow made it easier to say true things. Roy wrote about his work and his thoughts, and the way the Texas landscape looked in different seasons. He wrote about what he wanted from his life and what he was afraid he had already missed. He was more honest on paper than he might have been in person, and he was honest enough in person. Edith wrote about her grief and her anger at what had been done to her, about the farm she had lost and the person she had been before, and the person she was deciding to become now. She was direct and unsparing with herself in a way that Roy found both admirable and unexpectedly moving. They wrote through September and October and November, and by December the letters had grown longer and more frequent. Mrs. Gentry, who was perceptive about most things, noticed the correspondence and said nothing about it directly but started giving Edith Sunday afternoons off, which she had not previously done, on the grounds that everyone needed time to themselves. Roy wrote in December to say that the Rocking H had offered him a share in the ranch if he agreed to take over as full manager the following year, which would mean fewer drives and a more settled situation. He said he had not made his decision yet. He said it depended somewhat on things he was still thinking about. Edith read that letter several times and felt her heart doing something it had not done in a long time, which frightened her and also felt, tentatively, like something worth being frightened for. She wrote back and said she hoped he would make the decision that was right for him, and that a settled situation sounded like a thing worth having if the place and the work were right. She said this as carefully and non-presumptively as she could, but she suspected he would understand what she meant. He understood exactly what she meant. He wrote back within a week to say he had accepted the ranch manager position, and that he would be coming through Caldwell in the spring when the drive season started, to oversee the sale of the Rocking H's northern herd. He said he hoped she would have supper with him again. Edith put that letter down and sat very still for a moment. Then she smiled, which was something she had not done with her whole face in longer than she could exactly calculate. It felt unfamiliar and good, the way that physical therapy feels when a healing wound starts to move properly again. She wrote back and said she would be delighted to have supper with him. The winter was long and the correspondence continued, rich and detailed, and by February both of them were writing things that had moved well past the professional and the cautious and into something that neither of them was quite ready to name directly on paper, but that was unmistakable in the spaces between the words. Roy arrived in Caldwell in early April 1880 on a bright, windy day when the prairie grass was just starting to show green, and the sky was an enormous, cloudless blue. He rode in ahead of the Rocking H herd, which would arrive the following day, and went straight to the Drover's Rest Hotel and asked for Mrs. Rhodes. Edith came down the stairs from the upper office where she had been working, and they looked at each other across the lobby. After 8 months of letters, seeing him again was both exactly what she had expected and entirely different, the way that hearing a piece of music for the second time reveals things you missed the first. He looked the same and also more familiar now, and she felt the reality of him in a way she had only previously felt on paper. He took his hat off. "Mrs. Rhodes," he said. "Mr. Fairchild," she said. They stood there for a moment. There was something between them that the months of letters had built, warm and solid and undeniable, and they were both conscious of it. "You look well," he said. "You look like you rode a long way," she said. He smiled at that. It was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and changed them from quiet to warm. "I did," he said. "Supper tonight." 6 o'clock, she said. "The dining room is fine." He nodded and went to see about a room, and Edith went back upstairs and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the April street and the cattle pens and the wide Kansas sky, and told herself firmly to breathe. Supper that evening was different from the last time. There was no getting to know you formality, because they had already done that on paper. They sat down as people who were already deep in each other's confidence, and the conversation moved with the ease of something that has been flowing for a long time and found its channel. They talked about their letters and laughed about the parts that had been awkward on paper and discussed things they had each been thinking about since the last reply arrived. Roy told her about the Rocking H and what it was like to be running a ranch rather than trailing cattle, the different quality of the work, and what he liked and disliked about it. He said the stillness of it was strange after so many years of constant movement, but that he was finding things in it he had not expected. "Roots," he said, carefully, and then looked at her with an expression that was perfectly controlled and also completely transparent. Edith felt the word land somewhere in the center of her chest and stayed very calm and said, "I think roots are worth having when the ground is solid enough." "I think so too," he said. After supper they walked out onto the hotel porch, which looked west toward the empty prairie and the last of the April sunset, which was all copper and violet and enormous. The wind had died down and the evening was cool and quiet, the cattle town's noise muffled behind them. They stood at the porch railing and Roy said, without turning to look at her, "I want to be direct with you because I think you prefer directness and because I think you deserve it." "I do prefer it," she said. He turned then and looked at her squarely with those gray eyes that went very still when he was thinking carefully. "I have been thinking about you since July," he said. "Not in a way I can easily put aside. Not in a way I particularly want to put aside. I know your situation is complicated, and I know you are careful about what you build your life on, and I think that is exactly right. I'm not asking you for anything tonight except for the chance to spend the time I'm in Caldwell making a case that I might be worth taking a chance on." Edith looked at him for a long moment. The prairie stretched out behind him, enormous and darkening, and he stood in front of it like something that belonged there. "You've already been making your case," she said. "For 8 months in writing." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to say it out loud." "Roy," she said. She had not called him by his first name before, and she watched his expression register it. "I am not impulsive and I am not reckless. I will not pretend I'm not afraid of what it would mean to trust someone again. But I have also spent 8 months reading your letters and getting to know you better than I have known most people in my life. So I am not going to play at being unmoved when I am not unmoved." He looked at her with something in his expression that was quiet and careful and very warm. "What are you saying?" he said. "I am saying that your case is already fairly compelling," she said, "and that I am willing to see where this goes, honestly and with both of us understanding that there are no guarantees." He nodded slowly. "No guarantees," he said. "But I mean what I say, and I will not be Thomas Rhodes's brother-in-law. Whatever I tell you is true." The mention of what had happened with her late husband's family was deliberate and careful, showing her he had heard and remembered every word of what she had written about it. She felt something inside her that had been braced for a long time ease slightly. "I believe you," she said simply. The drive days that followed were busy for Roy, with cattle sales and logistics, and managing the Rocking H's business interests in Caldwell. But every evening that he was free, he spent with Edith, and every evening the thing between them grew more solid and more real. They walked the main street after supper, talking about everything and nothing. They rode out one Sunday afternoon to the edge of town, where the prairie opened up flat and enormous, and sat on a low hill, and watched the wind move through the grass like a slow green wave. Roy talked about what he was building at the Rocking H, a real house being constructed to replace the original foreman's quarters, land he was acquiring with the ranch partnership, a future that was beginning to take a definite shape. Edith listened and watched his face when he talked about it, the way he moved his hands slightly when he was describing something he was excited about, which was more movement than he usually allowed himself. She was falling in love with him. She knew it clearly, the way you know things that arrive without drama but settle in deeply and permanently. It did not feel like the young, rushing love she had felt for Thomas in the beginning. It felt like something more considered and more durable, built out of real knowledge of who he was. She was also afraid of it. Fear and love, she had learned, were not opposites. On his last evening in Caldwell, with the cattle sold and the crew rested, and the ride back to Texas beginning at dawn, Roy and Edith sat in the hotel dining room later than they should have, long after the other tables had emptied, and Mrs. Gentry had gone upstairs and the serving girl had gone home. The lamp on their table burned low and the room was very quiet. Roy held his coffee cup and did not drink from it. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that if the answer is no, I will accept that without making it difficult." Edith folded her hands on the table and waited. "I'm coming back through Caldwell in the fall," he said. "But I would rather come back with a reason more definite than business. I would like to come back and ask you properly. I want to marry you, Edith. I want to build that house at the Rocking H, and I want you to be in it. I want to know that the letters don't have to stop because we are close enough not to need them." He said it quietly and directly, the way he said everything, and he watched her face with the controlled patience of someone who means what he says and is prepared for any answer. Edith looked at him for a long time. The lamplight moved between them. "You said you would come back in the fall and ask me properly," she said. "Which implies you are not asking me properly right now." A slight, careful smile at the corner of his mouth. "I'm asking you if asking you in the fall would be a worthy endeavor," he said. She looked at her hands and then back at him. "Roy Fairchild," she said quietly, "if you come back in the fall and ask me properly, my answer will be yes." He was very still for a moment. Then the careful smile became real and warm, and she felt it somewhere in her center like the first day of genuine heat after a long winter. "Then I will be back in the fall," he said. He left at dawn, as he had said he would, and Edith stood on the hotel porch in the cool morning and watched the last of the rocking H crew disappear south down the trail, and then went inside to start her day, feeling as though the world had taken on a different quality of light. The summer of 1880 in Caldwell was hot and busy and full. The cattle drives moved through in their slow, enormous rhythm, and Edith kept the Drovers' Rest Hotel's books and managed the supply ordering and was good at her work. She and Roy continued to write, and the letters now had a different quality to them, the warmth of people who have told each other the important things and are now simply maintaining contact across distance. He wrote about the house being built at the Rocking H, about the timber arriving from San Antonio and the plans for the layout of the rooms. She wrote about Caldwell and her work and what she was thinking about, and sometimes about what she was hoping for, which was a new thing for her to put on paper. She also did something practical that summer. She wrote to a lawyer in Wichita, a different one from the men who had robbed her after Thomas died, a man Mrs. Gentry had recommended as honest. She wanted to understand exactly what legal standing she had regarding her late husband's farm and whether anything could be recovered. The answer that came back was what she had suspected, which was that the paperwork had been done carefully enough to make legal recovery difficult and expensive. She read the letter and felt the old anger stir, clean and controlled, and then she made a deliberate decision to let it go. Not because it was not unjust, but because carrying it further would cost her more than she was willing to spend on people who were not worth the price. She had a future ahead of her. She chose to face it instead of looking backward. She told Roy about this in a letter, and his response was one of the most thoughtful things she had ever read, about the difference between acceptance and surrender, and how choosing not to continue fighting something was not the same as agreeing it was right. He said she had made a clear-headed and brave choice. She held the letter until the paper softened at the fold. September came, and then October, and the drives were winding down and the cattle trade in Caldwell slowing toward its winter quiet. Edith found herself watching the road south with a frequency that she found both embarrassing and completely understandable. Roy arrived on the 14th of October, on a cold, bright Tuesday with a sky the color of pale blue enamel and leaves skittering across the main street of Caldwell in a dry west wind. He rode in alone this time, no crew, no herd, just a man on a good horse with a saddlebag and a purpose. He came to the hotel, and this time Edith was already in the lobby when he walked in, because she had seen him coming down the street from the upstairs window and had managed to come down in a way that she hoped appeared calm and accidental. He came through the door and she was standing there, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then he smiled, that real warm smile that changed his whole face, and said, "Mrs. Rhodes." "Mr. Fairchild," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, which she was proud of. He set his saddlebag down. He was carrying something else, a small paper-wrapped package, which he held out to her. She unwrapped it and found a copy of David Copperfield, new and unread, with a note inside the front cover in his handwriting that said, "For continued conversations on characters who choose the hard, honest thing." She laughed. It was a clean, full laugh, and she felt it from her chest outward. He was watching her with those still, warm eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I came to do a thing," he said. "Can we walk?" They walked out of the hotel and down the main street and south to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie, the same direction they had gone before. The October light was low and golden, stretching long shadows across the pale grass, and the wind was cold and smelled of coming winter. They walked until the town was behind them and the prairie was large in front of them. Roy stopped and turned to face her. He did not go down on one knee, which was a thing some men did and which she had always privately felt was a performance. He stood in front of her on the flat Kansas prairie and said, quietly and directly, "Edith, I meant what I said in April, and I have thought of nothing that changes it. I want to share my life with you. I want to build something real with you in it. I'm asking you to marry me if you will." She looked at him for a moment, this man who was steady and honest, and who had read Jane Eyre on night watch, and who had argued with her about Rochester, and who had written her letters for a year that were more real than most things people said in person. She thought about the farm she had lost, and the grief she had carried, and the walls she had built, and the slow, careful way she had let herself believe that something good might still be possible. She took a breath of cold prairie air and said, "Yes, I will marry you, Roy Fairchild." He stepped forward and took her hands in both of his, and they stood there on the prairie with the wind moving through the grass and the wide sky above them and the cattle town small behind them, and it was, Edith thought, exactly the right place for this particular moment. No ornament and no performance, just two honest people in the open country. He bent his head and kissed her, and it was the kind of first kiss that is also a beginning, warm and deliberate and entirely sincere. She kissed him back and felt the walls she had been maintaining for 3 years go quietly to nothing, like a fire that has been tended long past its usefulness. They were married in Caldwell 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in early November when the sky was gray and the air had the clean bite of coming winter. The ceremony was small and practical, conducted by the circuit preacher who came through Caldwell on his monthly rounds. Mrs. Gentry served as Edith's witness and made a point of not crying, though she pressed Edith's hands very hard and said simply, "Good." Roy's witness was a man named Frank Delacroix who had worked on drives with him for 7 years, a quiet, dark-bearded man from Louisiana who had made the ride up from the Rocking H specifically for the occasion, and who actually did cry quietly during the vows, which he was unembarrassed about. Edith wore a dress she had made herself from deep blue wool, because she had refused to wear white on a second marriage and had chosen instead the color of a Texas winter sky, which Roy said suited her perfectly. He wore his good coat and a clean shirt and looked at her during the ceremony with an expression so unguarded and honest that she had to look away briefly to keep her composure. After the ceremony, Mrs. Gentry provided a lunch at the hotel and made her famous apple cake, which was not a thing she did for everyone. The four of them ate and talked, and the fire in the dining room fireplace was warm, and the November wind was outside where it belonged. That evening, Roy and Edith began the long ride south to Texas. It was not the season for traveling, and the journey took them through cold days and campfires and a rainstorm that soaked everything and dried slowly over 2 days of riding. They talked constantly, which was one of the things Edith learned about their life together on that first journey. They never seemed to run out of things to say to each other. They talked about what they wanted from the ranch and what the house would look like and what they each thought about things. They disagreed sometimes, cleanly and without damage, and figured things out. It was easy in the way that things are easy when two people are matched in their fundamental orientation, in the way they approach honesty and work and the world. Edith also felt, for the first time in years, safe. Not in the sense of being protected from hardship, because she was riding through cold wind and sleeping on hard ground on the way to a ranch she had never seen, and none of that was soft, but safe in the way of knowing who was beside her and being certain of him. It was a feeling she had not expected to have again, and she was quietly, deeply grateful for it. The Rocking H Ranch sat in the rolling brush country of South Texas, in a landscape utterly different from the Kansas prairie Edith had known. The land was thorny and dry and golden in the November light, studded with live oaks and mesquite, and it smelled of cedar and dry grass and the particular mineral quality of South Texas air. The house Roy had been building was not fully finished, but it was solid, with 4 rooms and a wide porch and good thick walls of pale limestone cut from a local quarry. 2 rooms were complete and livable. 2 more were framed and under construction. Edith stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at the limestone walls and the clay tile floor and the window that faced west toward the setting sun, and felt something move in her that she recognized after a moment as the simple, powerful feeling of arriving at a place that is going to be home. "It needs a great deal of work," Roy said, standing behind her and watching her face. "Yes," she said. "It's wonderful." The winter months at the Rocking H were the first really settled time Edith had known since before Thomas died. She threw herself into the work of making the house livable, and then beautiful in the practical, functional way of someone who had grown up, understanding that beauty and utility were not separate things. She made curtains from fabric ordered from San Antonio. She organized the kitchen with the same methodical competence she had brought to the hotel's supply ordering. She learned the ranch's accounting system, which was functional but not as organized as it could be, and rebuilt it with the careful two-ledger system she had developed at the Drover's Rest. Roy watched her work with a quality of attention that she gradually realized was one of the most sustained compliments she had ever received. He did not watch her because she was a novelty or because he was monitoring her. He watched her the way someone watches a fire on a cold evening, because it is warm and it is real, and it is genuinely good to be near. She watched him too, as she came to know him in the domestic details that letters never convey. He woke before dawn every morning without complaint, and went to work with the kind of quiet, total competence that made it look easy. He was direct with the ranch hands without being harsh, and they respected him with the respect that is earned rather than demanded. He was good with horses in the particular way of someone who has spent a lifetime with them, patient and firm, and genuinely attentive to their nature. He read every evening by lamplight when the work was done, and he made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and he had a habit of humming very quietly to himself when he was doing something he found satisfying, so quietly she barely heard it, and she loved him for it in a way that snuck up on her and settled in. They were happy. It was not the dramatic happiness of stories, but the real kind, built day by day out of shared work and honest conversation, and the particular joy of waking up beside someone whose presence in your life makes it richer and more worthwhile than it would be without them. In the early spring of 1881, a situation arose on the Rocking H that tested both of them in ways that were less comfortable than the ordinary good days. The ranch had a neighbor to the east, a larger operation called the Craddock Beef Company, run by a man named Harlan Craddock, who had a disagreeable habit of allowing his cattle to drift onto other people's land, and then challenging anyone who objected to it. Craddock was wealthy and well-connected, and had a history of gradually absorbing smaller ranches by making their owners' lives difficult enough that they sold at low prices. He turned his attention to the Rocking H in March, when 3 of his men rode onto the ranch's eastern pasture and began disputing the fence line in a way that was clearly strategic. Roy handled the initial confrontation calmly and firmly, making it clear that the Rocking H's fence lines were correctly placed and that he had the survey documents to prove it. He sent one of his hands to Laredo to file the documents with the county recorder as a legal protection, which was the right procedural move. Craddock then sent a lawyer with a counterclaim, and the dispute became a legal and paperwork matter that Edith found herself drawn into by necessity, because managing the documentation fell to her. She was methodical and careful about it, gathering every land record and survey report and original title document the ranch had, and organizing them in a way that made the Rocking H's case as clear as possible. There were evenings when both of them sat at the table in the main room with papers spread between them, Roy working through the practical ranch responses and Edith working through the legal documentation, and it was one of those evenings that Edith, looking up from a deed survey, said, "He's trying to move the eastern line by a quarter mile. This survey from 1876 puts the original corner post exactly where our fence is." Roy looked at the document she held out. "Can that hold up?" "If we file it correctly and get someone with legal standing to verify it, yes," she said. "You need a proper lawyer, Roy, not just the documents." He looked at her steadily. I was going to handle it with Craddock directly. Craddock has a lawyer, she said. Direct conversations with men like that are only useful if you have legal backing behind you. Otherwise, they just use your good faith to buy time. He was quiet for a moment. You sound like someone who has dealt with this before. I have, she said, and there was something steady and hard in her voice that was not anger but was the near relative of it, the residue of experience. I lost a farm to paperwork I did not understand soon enough. I will not watch you lose this ranch the same way. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen before, something that was past respect and into the territory of genuine awe. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. You are remarkable, he said quietly. I am practical, she said. It's the same thing in a crisis. Write to that lawyer in San Antonio. Do it this week. He did. The San Antonio lawyer, a sharp, methodical man named Ellsworth, took the case and filed the necessary documents within the month. Craddock backed off the fence line dispute shortly after, redirecting his expansion efforts to a direction that offered less resistance. The Rocking H's eastern pasture was secure. Roy told Edith about Craddock's retreat on an evening in late May when the Texas dusk was long and warm and they were sitting on the porch together watching the light go out of the sky. Ellsworth says the filing spooked him, Roy said. He doesn't want a court case because the survey evidence is too clear. Good, Edith said. You saved the ranch, Roy said. He said it simply, which was his way. We saved the ranch, she said. You knew what the right documents were. I just organized them. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the porch rail, and they sat together in the warm evening. And the question of who had done what was irrelevant because they were the same enterprise and had been since the day they married. It was around that time that Edith told Roy she was expecting their first child. She told him on a quiet morning in June, with the sun coming in through the kitchen window and both of them at the table with their coffee, and she said it plainly because that was how she said things. She watched his face as she spoke, and what she saw there was not a performance of happiness but happiness itself, immediate and unguarded, the kind that a person cannot fake because it moves across a face before the thinking part of the mind can shape it. He was out of his chair and around the table before she had fully finished her sentence, and he took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was unusual for his normally economical way with gestures, and he looked at her with those still gray eyes that were not still at all right now, and said, Edith, and then could not immediately say anything else. I know, she said. I am, he started. I know, she said again, and smiled at him. He sat back down and they drank their coffee and planned and talked, and the morning light moved across the limestone floor of their house, and the baby was already, in some new and irreversible way, part of everything. The pregnancy was not easy in its middle months. The Texas summer heat in 1881 was fierce, and Edith, who was not someone who complained about physical discomfort, found herself more limited than she was accustomed to being. Roy managed the adjustment with such natural care that it took her a while to notice how much of her usual work he had quietly absorbed. He reorganized his day so that he was closer to the house in the hours when the heat was worst. He made sure there was always fresh water and that the kitchen was not unbearably hot by midday. He did not fuss about it or make a great thing of it. He simply arranged things so that she was more comfortable, which was both the practical thing and one of the most loving things Edith had ever experienced. She tried once to tell him that she did not need looking after and that she was perfectly capable. He said, I know you are. I'm looking after you because I want to, not because I think you can't manage. She looked at him for a moment and then said, all right. Because it was true, and because the distinction he was making was exactly right, and because she understood now what it felt like to be loved in a way that was about her actual self, and not about some idea of what she should be. The baby came in late December of 1881, in the limestone house on the Rocking H, attended by the doctor from Laredo and a neighbor woman who had more practical experience with births than the doctor did. Roy stayed as close as he was permitted and paced the porch in the blue Texas winter dark. And when the doctor finally came out and told him he had a son, He went very still for a moment in a way that Edith, from the other side of the door, would have recognized as his particular way of experiencing something too large for immediate response. They named the boy James Thomas Fairchild, James for Roy's father and Thomas as a deliberate acknowledgement of Edith's past, because she said that Thomas had been a good man and deserved better than to be forgotten because his family had behaved badly, and Roy agreed without hesitation. James was a dark-haired, serious-eyed baby who grew into a dark-haired, serious-eyed toddler who followed his father around the ranch yard with a dogged earnestness that made the ranch hands grin and Roy's whole face go soft in the way it only went soft for his family. Edith watched this and felt a happiness so ordinary and complete that it sometimes surprised her. Not the dramatic happiness of stories, she thought again, but the real kind, which was better. The years moved as years do on a working ranch, full of weather and animals and the endless practical problems and solutions of running land and livestock. Roy's share in the Rocking H grew as the original partners gradually drew back from the daily operation, and he took on more. And by 1884, he was effectively the primary owner, the original Rocking H having been restructured to reflect the reality of who was doing the work and building the value. The ranch was profitable and growing, and the house had all 4 rooms finished and furnished, and a wide garden that Edith had planted and tended into productivity. There were hard times within the good ones, because hard times come to everyone. There was a drought in the summer of 1883 that cost them 24 cattle and one of their best horses, and made the finances genuinely difficult for several months. There was a winter illness that moved through the Rocking H in 1884 and took one of their most experienced hands, an older man named Samuel who had worked cattle all his life, and whose death affected Roy more than he showed and more than Edith let him pretend it didn't. She sat with him on the porch the evening after Samuel was buried and did not say anything useful because there was nothing useful to say, and he put his arm around her and they sat in the quiet dark, which was the thing that was needed. In the spring of 1884, Edith discovered she was expecting again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, the summer milder, her body more experienced with the process. Roy's eldest sister came from San Antonio to visit for a month and was warmly welcomed, because she was a sensible and kind woman who clearly adored her brother and clearly approved of his wife, and Edith appreciated the company and the help. The second child was born in October of 1884, a girl this time, small and fair-haired in a way that surprised both parents since neither of them was fair-haired. They named her Clara June, the first name chosen by Roy with no explanation and no apology, and Edith accepted it because she understood what it meant. He was a man who honored his past without being owned by it, which was something she found valuable and true. Clara June was fair and curious, and loud in a way that her brother was not, filling rooms with sound and personality from her earliest days, and the contrast between the two children was a constant source of quiet amusement to both parents. Life on the Rocking H in the mid-1880s was rich in the ways that matter and simple in the ways that make richness possible to sustain. Roy managed the ranch with the same quality of clear, direct competence he had always brought to everything. Edith managed the books and the household and the garden and 100 other things, and also kept correspondence with several women in Caldwell and one in Wichita who had become real friends over the years. Mrs. Gentry wrote from Caldwell every few months, always businesslike, always with some dry observation about the ongoing chaos of the cattle trade town, and always ending with a request for the apple cake recipe that Edith had developed from the original, which Alma Gentry insisted was better than hers, and which Edith graciously declined to confirm or deny. Frank Delacroix, who had cried at the wedding, had stayed in touch with Roy, and eventually moved his family to a ranch 2 days' ride away, which meant occasional visits and a genuine friendship that deepened with time and proximity. His wife Marguerite became one of Edith's closest friends, a frank and funny woman who had opinions about everything and expressed them freely, which Edith found refreshing after years of being the most opinionated person in any given conversation. One June evening in 1886, Roy and Edith were sitting on the porch after supper while James, now 4 years old, played with a wooden horse in the yard, and Clara, who was 18 months and had recently mastered walking and considered it the greatest achievement of human history, toddled after him with determined enthusiasm. The evening air smelled of cedar and warm stone and the distant cook fire from the bunkhouse, and the sky was turning the particular shade of deep rose and gold that South Texas evenings sometimes produced, as though the landscape was trying to outdo itself. Roy was watching his children in the yard with an expression of simple contentment that Edith had learned to recognize as his deepest form of happiness. She was watching him, which was something she did sometimes when he was not aware of it, studying the lines of his face that were more settled now than they had been when she first met him, the small changes that 8 years had made in a person she knew completely. "Roy," she said. He looked at her. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited in his way. "When I rode into Caldwell in 1879, she said, "I was not looking for anything except a job and a roof. I had decided very firmly that what I had lost was simply gone and that the best I could do was be useful and self-sufficient and not expect anything more." She paused. "I was completely wrong." He looked at her with those gray eyes that had stopped being still, that had not been fully still since the day she said yes on the Kansas prairie. "I was done with love," he said. "I told myself that very clearly. It was a practical decision based on evidence." "Yes," she said. "We were both spectacularly wrong." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was related to one, warm and genuine. "The best kind of wrong," he said. She reached across the porch rail and took his hand, and they sat watching James and Clara in the yard in the rose-gold evening, the ranch around them solid and earned and real. And Edith thought about the woman she had been on a stage going south into Caldwell with a carpetbag and a loaded derringer and a heart that had closed in on itself. And she thought about who she was now, which was that same woman who had made it through the hard things and come out the other side into something she had not dared to believe was possible. Love, she had learned, was not the dramatic thing she had been taught to expect from books and stories. It was not the sweep and the thunder. It was the man who reorganized his day so the kitchen was not too hot. It was the letter that arrived at the right moment and said the true thing. It was someone making the hard, honest choice instead of the comfortable, dishonest one, over and over, every day, in small things and large. It was Roy Fairchild watching his children from a porch in the evening, turning to look at her with a face full of something she had spent years thinking she might never see directed at her again, and meaning it with every part of himself. "Roy," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. "I love you," he said. "I have since a storage room in Caldwell when you explained the Debelentry ledger system to me with more patience than my question deserved." She laughed at that, fully and genuinely, and he was smiling at her. And in the yard James had given up the wooden horse to Clara and was building something in the dirt with a stick, serious and focused, entirely himself. Clara was examining the wooden horse with the intense scientific curiosity she applied to everything, turning it over in her small hands. The evening deepened around them, and the first stars appeared in the Texas sky, enormous and close in the way of open country stars, and the rocking H sat quiet and solid in its landscape, and the life that two careful, guarded people had built together out of letters and honesty, and the willingness to try again, was settled and full and good. The following years brought more of the same good texture of real life. James grew into a boy who was serious and curious, and who took to ranch work with the focused competence of someone to whom practical skills came naturally. Roy taught him to ride before he was 6 and to handle a rope before he was 8, and the boy was a natural with animals in the way that some people simply are, quiet and confident and patient. He had Roy's gray eyes and Edith's directness, and a particular stubbornness that both parents privately attributed to the other. Clara was her own entirely, fair-haired and loud and brilliant in a way that announced itself early. She had Edith's capacity for numbers, which became apparent when she was barely 5 and started correcting the addition in the household tally book with cheerful confidence. Roy observed this phenomenon with undisguised pleasure and brought her the same kind of small ledger book Edith kept, which Clara treated as the most serious possession she owned, which it was. By the late 1880s, the rocking H had grown considerably from the operation Roy had taken over. He had expanded the herd carefully and acquired 2 additional pasture sections to the south, and the ranch was employing 6 full-time hands and running one of the better cattle operations in that part of South Texas. Edith's bookkeeping had become something the neighboring ranches occasionally asked about, and she had taken on 2 other ranches' accounts on a consulting basis, which she found genuinely interesting and which added meaningfully to the household finances. In 1888, Edith received a letter from her younger sister in Ohio, whom she had not seen since before Thomas died, and who wrote to say she was recently married and coming west with her husband, who was a surveyor taking work in the growing Texas railroad business. Edith wrote back with an invitation to visit the rocking H, and in the fall of that year her sister Margaret and her husband arrived, and with them came the particular warmth of family connection that Edith had not had in a long time. Margaret was 7 years younger than Edith and bore a certain physical resemblance that made James look between them with puzzled interest. She was cheerful and adaptable, and took immediately to ranch life with the curiosity of someone experiencing something genuinely new. Her husband David was a quiet, precise man who got along well with Roy in the way that quiet, precise men sometimes do, finding in each other a comfortable register of conversation that did not require more effort than either of them wanted to spend. The visit lasted 3 weeks and ended with an invitation extended by both parties to repeat it, which they did the following year and the year after that. Margaret and David eventually settled in San Antonio, which was close enough for regular contact and comfortable visits, and Edith had her sister back in her life in a way that felt like the restoration of something she had grieved without naming. One spring afternoon in 1890, when James was 8 years old and Clara was 5, Roy came in from the south pasture earlier than usual and found Edith at the kitchen table with the ranch account spread in front of her, and a look of quiet satisfaction on her face that meant she had solved something. "Good numbers," she said, without looking up. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "Tell me." She walked him through the quarterly figures and the projection for the fall beef sale, and they talked through the ranch's financial situation with the thorough familiarity of 2 people who have been doing this together for nearly a decade. At the end of the conversation, Roy leaned back in his chair and said, "We should think about the north section." "For purchase," she said. "Delacroix mentioned the family that owns it is looking to sell. It's good grass. It would give us year-round grazing flexibility." Edith considered this. "What's the asking price?" he told her, and she was quiet for a moment, running through numbers in her mind. "If we get the price we're expecting from the fall sale, we could do it without drawing down the reserve too far," she said. "But we'd be tight for the winter." "Tight but not desperate," he said. "No," she said. "Not desperate." She looked at him. "It's a good idea. Do it." He nodded, satisfied, and drank his coffee, and they sat in the kitchen with the afternoon light coming in through the window and the accounts between them on the table, and it was quiet and good and real. The North Section purchase went through in November of 1890, and it was exactly what Roy had anticipated, adding both grazing flexibility and long-term value to the ranch. The fall beef sale came in at the price they had projected, which meant the winter was tight but manageable, and by spring the books were balanced and the ranch was stronger than it had been the previous year. James, at 9, had opinions about the north pasture, and had already identified which sections of new fence line needed reinforcement, which Roy acknowledged with a straight face and privately found delightful. Clara, at 6, had reorganized the household supply ledger into a system that was objectively more efficient than the one Edith had been using, and had presented this achievement to her mother with the calm authority of someone who considers good accounting to be a public service. Edith had looked at the reorganized ledger and said, "Clara, this is very good." Clara had said, "I know. The cross-referencing was the important part." Edith had looked across the room at Roy, who was maintaining a completely expressionless face with visible effort. "She gets that from you," he said. "She most certainly does," Edith agreed. In the spring of 1892, Edith found she was expecting again, which at 39 was surprising and also, she discovered, deeply welcome. Roy's response was the same as it had always been, that immediate and unguarded joy that she trusted completely, followed by the quiet rearrangement of his days to take on more of what she needed to set down. The third child was a boy, born in October of 1892, small and dark like James had been, but with a temperament that was immediately and obviously his own, sociable and vocal and interested in absolutely everything and everyone around him from his first hours. They named him George Edwin Fairchild, George for no one in particular, but because it suited him, and Edwin after Edith's father, who had died years before but who had been a good man and deserved to be remembered. George at 6 months had charmed every person on the rocking age within a radius that was still expanding. He had what the ranch hands called a real personality on him, and what Edith called an alarming capacity for getting people to do what he wanted, and what Roy called, with quiet accuracy, exactly like his mother. James, at 11, took to his little brother with the solemn responsibility of a firstborn who has always known this was part of his inheritance. Clara, at 8, taught George to clap before he was 6 months old, and considered this her finest pedagogical achievement to date. The 1890s moved with the settled rhythm of a life that had found its right shape. The rocking age continued to grow and improve. James grew toward a lanky, competent adolescence with Roy's gray eyes and his mother's precision. Clara became a girl who read everything she could get her hands on and kept books with a rigor that Edith stopped being surprised by and started simply appreciating. George became the sociable, energetic, occasionally chaotic center of whatever room he was in. Roy and Edith grew more deeply into each other as the years moved, in the way that people do when they have built something real together and are still genuinely interested in each other across the years. They still talked, long conversations at the end of the day or on Sunday mornings or riding out together to check the fences or the cattle, and the conversations were not repetitive but kept finding new ground because they were both the kind of people who kept thinking and kept changing in small ways while remaining fundamentally themselves. There were still hard things. There always were. The long drought of the mid-1890s hit South Texas hard and cost them 2 difficult years and real money. Roy's older brother died in 1896, and Roy was quiet about it for weeks in the way he was quiet about the things that hit him deepest, and Edith sat with him in the quiet and let him find his way through it without trying to rush the process. Roy's sister came from San Antonio and they grieved together as a family, which was its own kind of healing. But the hard things moved through, as hard things do when you have a structure strong enough to hold them, and the good things remained. In the summer of 1898, on a June evening that was warm and dry and bright with a South Texas sunset that painted the limestone house in shades of gold and amber, Roy and Edith sat on the porch as they had been sitting on porches together for 18 years, and they watched the ranch in the evening quiet. James was 19 now, and working the cattle alongside his father with the confidence of someone who had been bred to this land and this work. Clara was 16 and in the middle of a heated correspondence with a teacher in San Antonio about the possibility of continuing her education, which Edith was managing with the diplomatic skill the situation required, and the absolute certainty that Clara would have whatever education she was determined to get. George was 5 and asleep inside, having exhausted himself by the heroic physical effort of being George for an entire day. Roy said, "Do you remember that hotel storage room?" Edith looked at him. "With the flour sacks. You were counting them when I came in," he said. "You looked at me like you were trying to decide if I was worth talking to." "I was," she said. "I decided you were." "I know," he said. "I was terrified you wouldn't." She looked at him with mild surprise. Roy Fairchild did not use the word terrified about himself with any frequency. "You didn't show it," she said. "I was very careful not to," he said. She laughed softly. "So was I. I thought you would see how clearly I was not unmoved and think less of me for it." "I was hoping you were not unmoved," he said. They sat with that for a moment, the long-ago comedy of two careful people being careful with each other. "I am glad we were both bad at hiding it," she said. "So am I," he said. He took her hand on the porch rail in the way he had been taking her hand on porch rails for nearly 18 years, easy and certain, and they sat in the warm evening and watched the rocking H settle into its summer dusk. The ranch was real and solid and good. The house they had built room by room was home in every sense of the word. The children they had raised were becoming themselves in ways that were both surprising and deeply familiar. The life they had made together was the kind that does not announce itself or seek admiration, but simply continues, day by day, layering good things on good things until the total is something enormous. Edith thought about the woman on the stage to Caldwell, the grief and the fury and the terrible practical courage of someone who has lost everything and is rebuilding from nothing. She thought about what that woman would have thought if you could have told her what was coming, the letters and the prairie and the limestone house and the children and the porch evenings, and the man beside her whose hand was warm and steady and certain. She thought that woman would not have believed you. She thought she would have been glad to be wrong. Roy said quietly into the evening quiet, "I love you, Edith," she said. "I love you, Roy," and meant it with everything she was made of. The stars came out over the rocking H, enormous and clear in the South Texas dark, and the house was warm behind them, and their children were sleeping, and the land they had worked and earned and cared for stretched out in all directions around them, and there was nothing left unfinished, nothing unresolved, nothing left to fear that they could not face together. It was simply and completely enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.